Good evening. Wonderful. Good evening. I'm Rabbi Jonah Steinberg, and on behalf of Harvard Hillel and with Harvard's program on negotiation, I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's conversation, The Israel-Palestinian Conflict and the U.S. Negotiation Lessons and Possibilities. And as well as acknowledging Harvard's Center for Jewish Studies and the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations and the Jewish Law Students Association who have joined us in promoting tonight's event, I am so glad, there he is, to welcome Bill Berman, of Harvard's class of 1940, John F. Kennedy's Harvard class, if you're doing the math. And in fact, Mr. Berman was in JFK's entryway in Winthrop House back in the day, not far from here. And I mention Mr. Berman not only because it's a great delight and honor that he is here with us, but also because Ambassador Ross's appearance tonight alongside Chavirat Knesset Livni comes in the context of our Reisman Forum series on politics and policy, which the Mandel and Madeleine Berman Family Foundation have made possible in memory of Robert Reisman. And let me just say, especially because this evening's program touches on themes of armed conflict and on hopes of peace, that it is a very special privilege, and today an all too rare moment, straight out of the annals of this country's greatest generation, to hear Mr. Berman, whose own military service is notable and distinguished, speak with such admiration of Robert Reisman, both as a highly decorated soldier and as a man of letters and of culture. And as a Jewish chaplain in this university, let me say that when I listen to Mr. Berman describe Jewish religious observances put together for GIs overseas in the last days and in the aftermath of World War II, I'm filled with a sense of tremendous legacy and of how important it can be to enable Jewish life and Jewish culture to endure and to flourish in every imaginable circumstance. So thank you. And now, yes, please. And now to introduce this evening's panel, it is my great honor to introduce a friend and counselor, Professor Bob Mnookin, who is the Samuel Williston Professor of Law, as many of you know, at Harvard Law School, and the chair of the program on negotiation at Harvard Law School and the director of the Harvard Negotiating Research Project. Bob is the author and editor of a great many books, including, quite relevantly, Bargaining with the Devil, When to Negotiate, When to Fight. And it is also very relevant to mention that Bob has brought his considerable expertise and his devotion to facilitating a number of Track 2 diplomatic efforts involving off-the-record meetings with Israelis and Palestinians, and has written a number of articles on the conflict. And I will leave it to Bob to introduce our very distinguished guests for this evening. Welcome, and I hope you enjoy the evening.
Thank you very much, Jonah. What a pleasure to be here, and what a thrill it is for the program on negotiation and Hillel to sponsor this evening's event. I cannot imagine two people who could contribute more to our understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the U.S. role, and what the negotiation lessons and possibilities might be, which is our topic for tonight. Let me say a word about two people who, with this audience, probably hardly need much of an introduction. Knesset member Tzipi Livni has been aptly described as the most powerful woman in Israeli politics since Golda Meir. She's a prominent Israeli political figure and a former minister of foreign affairs. And as she was a key Israeli participant in multiple rounds of peace talks with the Palestinians. And Ambassador Dennis Ross is an American diplomat and author and scholar. For more than a generation, he has played a leading role in shaping U.S. policy in the Middle East. As a scholar, he's written more books than most members of the Harvard Law faculty. I'll say more about that in a minute. Let me add just a little bit more about Knesset member Livni. She too is not she too, I'm a lawyer, she's a lawyer.
Nobody's perfect.
And for that reason, I especially am thrilled to have her here at the law school. She's held 8 different cabinet positions, more than any other woman, and she's achieved any number of milestones. Among her milestones, Israeli politics, as many of you know, is a bit complicated.
Yeah.
And she began in the Likud party and was elected to the Knesset as a member of Likud. After Prime Minister Sharon proposed the evacuation of Gaza, she, along with Omer and Sharon, helped create and form in 2005 the Kadima Party. So she was a leader of the Kadima Party. And indeed, later, she, in fact, after the election of 2009, where Kadima had more votes but could not form a government, she was the leader of the opposition as the head of Kadima. Later, she, in fact, formed her own party called Hatnua, which is a pragmatic, peace-oriented party committed to a 2-state resolution. In fact, there was a division within Kadima, as I understand it, with respect to what the attitude ought to be towards attempting to reach a negotiated resolution. Following the 2013 elections, as a member of her party, she joined Prime Minister Netanyahu's government and was appointed by the Prime Minister as Justice Minister. But more importantly, for our purposes tonight, she participated in the carry round of negotiations and was, in fact, designated as the chief negotiator with the Palestinian Authority, along with the Foreign Minister, Lieberman, having special responsibilities for diplomatic relations with the United States and Europe as well. And she indeed played a key role during the Kerry initiative between July of 2013 and April of 2014. She had a falling out with Prime Minister Netanyahu, I think it would be fair to say, in December of 2014. And in the 2015 elections, she joined her party with the Labor Party in a coalition called the Zionist Union. And she now, as a member of the Knesset, serves on the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, a new subcommittee on an international lawfare. Is that right?
Yeah.
Lawfare. I wish my colleague, Gabby Bloom, were here, because she's very interested in lawfare. And also the Constitutional Law and Justice Committee. Now, Dennis Ross, I want to say a few words about him. He grew up in the Bay Area. We have lots in common. He grew up in the Bay Area, and we lived in the Bay Area for 23 years, although we didn't grow up there. And he also, and I've told him that I now feel a connection to this as well, went to UCLA. I have a daughter at UCLA, so that makes me feel a connection. He's now the William Davidson Distinguished Fellow and Counselor at the Washington Institute. Now, my sources say that you helped create and co-founded the Washington Institute. Is that true?
No.
Okay.
So check those sources. I wrote the first paper for the Washington Institute when I was out at Berkeley.
Okay. In all events, he was an academic at Berkeley, Stanford. We have that in common because I taught at both those places. And we overlapped we were comparing notes about Berkeley in the 80s, where Berkeley politics is unlike that of any other. It makes Cambridge politics seem conservative. I will simply report that. He worked in the Carter administration, the Defense Department, and during the Reagan administration was director of Near Eastern and South Asian affairs in the National Security Council. During George H.W. Bush's presidency, he had a critically important job as director of the State Department's policy planning staff. And he worked, for example, with Secretary James Baker, whom we interviewed as part of a project that Jim Sabinius and Nick Burns and I have done, relating to the reunification of Germany. He is an expert, by the way. We all know him in terms of his expertise on the Middle East. He was also, and was an expert on the Soviet Union and Russia. For tonight's purposes, it's very interesting to note that he worked with James Baker in convincing the Arab and Israeli leaders to attend the 1991 Middle East Conference in Madrid, Spain, which was the first time, under the auspices of the first President Bush's administration, that there was a formal meeting between Arab countries and the Israeli government. And there were all kinds of complexities about how the Palestinians would participate. Remarkably, President Bush lost, not remarkably, he lost his re-election. And President Clinton was elected. And guess who he worked on whose re-election campaign? Bush. Notwithstanding that fact, this shows how impressive this guy is. He worked for Bush's re-election, but Warren Christopher, President Clinton's first Secretary of State, asked him to stay on. And he ended up heading the Office of the Special Middle East Coordinator, an office which, headed by Dennis, contained the most remarkably talented group of people who remain centrally involved and experts in terms of the Middle East conflict. He sat out George W. Bush's administration and was, I guess, back at the Washington Institute during that time. And during the Obama administration, for 2 years, he served in a complicated role as assistant to President Obama on the National Security Council, as a senior director for what was called the Central Region, and as a special advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. He also was involved, and I'm going to ask a question later about this, with the Kerry Initiative and laying what was the foundation for that initiative. Now, if all of this weren't enough, I want to report that Ambassador Ross is the author of 3 books, all of which I've read and all of which are entirely admirable. One, The Missing Piece, really tells the story of the Camp David negotiations, both the prelude and what happened at the end of President Clinton's administration. The second book, Statecraft and How to Restore America's Standing in the World, is a marvelous book, and indeed parts of that book, together with Jim Sabinius and Nick Burns, we have assigned in our book on negotiation and diplomacy. And his latest book, which I commend to all of you, is called Doomed to Succeed, the U.S.-Israeli Relationship from Truman to Obama. So I simply want to say what a great pleasure it is for PLN and Hillel to have you both here. We're going to proceed as follows. They're going to each speak for about 15 minutes. Thereafter, I will ask a bunch of questions, or some questions, and they may ask each other questions as well. And then we're going to open it up to the audience. Let's begin. Knesset member Livni.
Thank you. Thank you and good evening. It is a great opportunity to be here with you tonight. And frankly, we work together, Dennis and I. And I can assure you that what was said here about Dennis is just part of what I know about his contribution to the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians. Sometimes it is on the stage, and sometimes it is behind the scene. But his contribution is something that you should know as well. And then I was thinking that maybe in order to understand what happened in the last round of negotiations, somebody is missing here, because we are here, the Israeli side, the chief negotiator of the Israeli side, the American side, and the Palestinians are not here. And I believe that the only way to understand what we missed and what we've done wrong, all of us, And I'm not playing the blame game. I think that it is more important to understand what went wrong with the Palestinians, and maybe not publicly, but this is something that needs to be done. By the way, I tried to do it after the negotiations stopped. I can share with you some of these meetings, but I think that this is not less important. Now, I was asked, both of us were asked to speak about the lessons of the negotiations, and I want to make it clear that there is one thing, one lesson that I would not take as part of the negotiations, and this is to stop negotiating in the future. Even though I tried twice as the chief negotiator on the Israeli side, but I believe, and trust me, I know that Einstein's definition for insanity, that doing the same thing again and again and expect different results. I'm not insane, I'm not mad, but I do believe that it is that important that we should try again and again in an understanding that it would never be the same. And sometimes not even by changing the negotiations, but also sometimes timing, situation can change, so we can have success or better in future negotiations to come. Another remark before I start relating to negotiations, it was said that I'm also a lawyer by profession. It is a law school here, but I'm not going to speak here as a lawyer. And there's a huge gap between negotiating as a lawyer for a client, something that I did for 10 years, or negotiating on behalf of your state. It's a completely different way of thinking. It's not only about the legal skills that we have, but also about decision-making, which are based on ideology. And frankly, I was a lawyer. I practiced law for 10 years. And I decided to close my own law firm in order to join politics just because I was driven by the idea that we need to end the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. Now, it was just after Oslo Agreement. It was 1995, few weeks before Prime Minister Rabin was murdered in Israel. And the Israeli society was divided between one camp that called itself the camp of the land of Israel, and they were talking about the rights of the Jewish people on the entire land. And I believe that the Jewish people has rights on the entire land, but yet I was focused in the need to keep Israel's values as a Jewish democratic state, and therefore my understanding was that we need to divide this tiny place between Jordan River, Mediterranean Sea, into two different states. One is Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, and the other is the future Palestinian state, is as the answer for the national aspirations of the Palestinians. It is also true that I criticized Oslo Agreement as a lawyer because I said that I practiced real estate, and I said that as a lawyer, I wouldn't have given a client of mine the possibility to sell his second-hand apartment and to give the apartment without getting the full consideration, the full amount of money. And basically, Oslo Agreement was not a real contract, a real agreement. It was more of, I don't know, memorandum of understanding, basically speaking in large, about the need to continue. Some was specific, but they decided to postpone all the core issues, the most dramatic, difficult issues, to the future. And I believe then that what we need to do is to try and to continue the negotiations until we can reach a comprehensive peace treaty with all the details, a kind of a manual for the day after, so each and every side would know what the other side needs to do and what he needs to do in order to achieve peace. We are 20 years later. I think that were 3 or even more rounds between Israel and the Palestinians, and we still didn't reach the peace treaty. Now, some of my friends in Israel gave up the possibility to achieve peace. And frankly, you shared with them the different parties that I led, or I'm still in. And basically, what I thought in 1995, the reason for me to be in politics is the same reason. And I believe that this is an Israeli interest. I believe that we shouldn't give up not only hope for peace, but also to promote, to restart negotiations, and to try to find a solution to the situation. I believe that the time that passes by without an agreement serves the interest of the extremists, both sides. I believe that stagnation and stalemate, the meaning is deterioration. It's in a way like a blood pressure, you know. You don't feel it until it happens. And some of my friends believe that we can manage the conflict, but what I see, unfortunately, that the conflict manages us, that the conflict infiltrated into Israel, affects the life of Israel, affects the position, and this is connected to everything that we do in Israel, and therefore it's not a favor to the Palestinians to reach a peace treaty or to negotiate, and it's not even a favor to the President of the United States. This is something that we need to do because this is our own interest, and there is no vacuum in the international community. If we would not initiate, so somebody would. And I prefer to initiate this myself, to negotiate with them, to do it in direct negotiations, and not to find ourselves one day with the friend. I don't know what would be the next initiative, whether it be in English American or in French, in American English or French, or I don't know, in another language. I prefer this to be in Hebrew, Arabic language. I believe that this is the right thing to do. So basically, it's about the vision. It's about my vision about the state of Israel, the need to keep the values of the state of Israel. And I prefer to reach a final status agreement because this serves the interest, I believe, of both sides. But as an Israeli, it serves our own interest. Now, frankly, we live in a tough neighborhood. I don't speak about peace like in a romantic manner. I don't think that we would just sign an agreement and we would live happily ever after. It's not a fairy tale. It's the Middle East. But I do believe that an agreed solution serves our interest because we need an agreed border. And this is something that can be achieved in negotiations. And we need all our security terms to be agreed upon. I know that the moment in which we agree something with the Palestinians, the entire international community would adopt it. They truly don't care what would be the substance. As long as the Palestinians agree, they would adopt it. And more than that, I believe that we need a signature, meaning that this is the end of conflict, even though it would take some time until we really express peace as it is and not just peace treaty, not just a piece of paper. If we cannot end the conflict, there is another possibility, and this is to try and reach something interim, reach understandings that would reduce violence and would give us the possibility to live together until we reach peace treaty. And if not, and only then, we have the third option, and this is to take some steps toward two-state solution as an Israeli initiative that would keep the option of achieving an agreement in the future, but not waiting to the other side to agree to it. I mean, even if peace is not just around the corner, I don't want Israel to be hostage by the other side, waiting for him to sign what is needed in order to achieve peace. And as I said before, it is our interest. Okay, now, what is important in the negotiations? First thing, it's very important that the idea of negotiating is not a decision whose narrative is more just. It's not about narratives. By the way, I tried. The first meeting in the Annapolis process was I started to speak with Abu Allah on the other side about the Bible, about the Jewish people, all this stuff. He was talking about his family. And then after 2 meetings, we said, OK, we understood each other. Now let's speak about the future of generations to come and not about the history. Each side can keep his own narrative as long as we agree what needs to be done for the future. Secondly, very important when you negotiate, not to think, and excuse me, I know that this is something that Netanyahu is saying, what he says is, if they give, they would get. Wrong. We should start negotiating by thinking what we are getting from the negotiations. It is less important. I mean, it's very difficult sometimes to give because the topics that are on the table are very important, sensitive, and crucial for both sides. But in the end, we should think, this package, what does it give to us? This is more important. And thirdly, and we are talking about Israel, US, Palestinians, I believe that there is no replacement for direct negotiations. Now, I want to say that without Secretary Kerry, we wouldn't have the last round of the negotiations. He was enthusiastic about it, focused, I mean, didn't give up, in a way forced both sides to restart the negotiations, something that was very important. But during the negotiations, I believe in meetings. I believe in looking in the eyes of the other side, understanding what are the problems on the other side. And I can give you a list of examples how during the negotiations, I can give one if I have some time. The Palestinians agreed that the future state would be demilitarized. Now, the first meeting, it was in the Annapolis process. I said, well, demilitarized state. They said no. Well, I tried to use Clinton's word, non-militarized. In English, you know, it was not there was no Palestinian state before, so it's not demilitarized, it's none. Okay, nice. No, they said no. So we have discussions and discussions. They said no. And then I said, listen, what's happening here? I mean, you know that you're not going to have an real army and tanks and air force. And they said it's about our dignity. It's about our sovereignty. We cannot agree to something which is a state minus. I said, okay, I respect your dignity. You're going to have an independent state, a sovereign state. But you know, there are some states in the world that took some limitation on their army. Germany, after the Second World War, Japan. I mean, in Cyprus, still there is a British base. Egypt, Sinai Desert is demilitarized in accordance to the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. So the idea is that we would sign in the first article of the agreement that you are creating a new independent state, and according to your decision, free will decision, you are taking the limitation on your army, and this state is going to be demilitarized. And if you don't agree to the second article, we would not sign the first one. So this is the deal, and they agreed to it. But it took us few meetings to understand. I mean, they knew that they are not going to have an army. But they needed this dignity, and the way to represent it, sometimes it's not less important than the agreement itself. Another thing is trust. Trust, I told you that I tried to understand why we failed. And I met Abu Mazen after the negotiations were stopped. And I asked him, why didn't you give an answer to President Obama? March 17, 2014, there was a meeting between President Obama and Abu Mazen. There was framework for negotiations that the American phrased, and we all waited for Abu Mazen to say, well, hopefully yes, and he didn't give an answer. So I met him later. By the way, it was the excuse of Netanyahu to fire me a few months later from the government, never mind. And I said, why didn't you give an answer? And he said, I don't trust him. I said, with all due respect, he doesn't trust you as well. It's not about trust.
Don't trust who? Netanyahu or Obama? Who was
no.
not trust?
Abu Mazen said to me that he doesn't, that Abu Mazen himself, he doesn't trust Netanyahu. And therefore, he didn't give an answer to Obama. And I said to him that Netanyahu doesn't trust him as well. But it's not about trust. It's about the US, and this is the role of the US. It's about the US putting framework for negotiations on the table. And both sides could continue the negotiations on the basis of this. with a kind of deniability that unfortunately my prime minister wants, and to say that it's an American paper and not an Israeli one. And Abu Mazen also can say that this is an American paper. So for both of them, as politicians, unfortunately, I wish we have more leaders and less politicians. But anyway, they could work and continue the negotiations on the basis of this. So what I said to Abu Mazen, that it's not about trust, but I believe that there is a need for trust. I mean, they didn't meet during all these negotiations. And I believe that trust can be built when the other side knows that one side knows that the other side is willing to pay some political prices, even for negotiations. And during these negotiations, or at the beginning of the negotiations, we had a meeting, the negotiator with President Obama, and he asked both of us, what is the advice for the negotiations? And I said, I hope that we would not let the background noises to enter into the negotiations room. And he said, what does it mean? I said, listen. Part of the understanding was that Israel would continue building in settlements. By the way, a huge mistake. And unfortunately, like always, we would face this way or another terror. And this can be the excuse for both sides to say that they stopped the negotiations. We should keep these noises out of the negotiations room, but we couldn't. For Israel, the choice was, in order to relaunch the negotiation, to choose between releasing all prisoners from jail, terrorists, or free settlements activities. The Israeli choice was to release prisoners. I believe that it was a mistake, because it was a lose-lose. When we released prisoners, it was a huge political price that we paid, because they are terrorists, and it's very problematic. They made their crimes before Oslo Agreement, but yet it was very problematic. And then in order to balance it, Israel decided to build in settlement. It was agreed in advance. We didn't break what was agreed before. But then the Palestinians couldn't absorb it. So it was a real lose-lose, a huge mistake that we did at the beginning of the negotiations. So just I would finish this introduction, but I want just to finish this with one thing. We are speaking about opportunities that we missed. I think that it is not less important not to miss the opportunity that we have now. And I believe that in the scale between final peace treaty or stalemate, there are steps that we can do in order to reduce the tension, in order to send a message that we are serious, that when we say two states for two peoples, we are willing to take some steps in order to do so. Because it is, well, the interest of both sides, but it is our interest. And as I said before, the blame game is not, I mean, it doesn't help. Who cares who's to blame when both sides are paying the price? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Ross.
Thank you. First, it's a pleasure to be here in general, but it's particularly a pleasure to be here with Tzipi. We have worked together in the past. She may not remember the first time we met. The first time we met was actually at Ben Gurion University, right after the Bush administration had come into power. I had been the negotiator throughout the Clinton period, and I had left. This was like 2 months after the end of the Clinton administration. It was March of 2001. And I was offering perspectives on Oslo and what had happened and why we hadn't succeeded and where we go from here. And Tzipi at that time was a how shall I put it, a genuine, full-fledged member of Likud, in every sense, by the way. And at the time, you were asking me some pretty hard questions about, what did I think the peace process was going to do? And you were offering questions from a highly skeptical perspective at that time, March 2001. But I was still struck by the questions, struck me not as someone who was ideological in this, but was sort of curious about, well, why did you think it could work, as opposed to, I'm against it in principle. Now, I raise it because Tzipi has evolved on this issue for what I would describe as the right reason. You said it tonight, by the way. You said peace is not a favor you do to the Palestinians. And you also added it's not a favor you do to the President of the United States. This is something that is in Israel's interest. And what has driven you, from the point that I've since gotten to know you well, is what does Israel need to remain a Jewish democratic state? More than anything else, that is what I think has motivated her. And oftentimes people ask me, why do I stay involved in this? Why, after 30-odd years of trying, why do I still care about it? And in no small part, it's because I actually care about Israel, not just the U.S. relationship with Israel, but because of Israel and having Israel fulfill its promise. And if it stays on the current path it's on, it will become a binational state, and that's not only not Israel's promise, that's ultimately a betrayal of the Zionist belief and aspiration. So her evolution, I think, reflects an interesting reality about how things have changed over time. I want to start by offering one observation on a lesson that I, in my own mind, I sort of developed when we were at Camp David in the year 2000, but I developed it too late. We had gone to Camp David because we had an Israeli government that, in my mind, was clearly prepared to do something that none of its predecessors had been prepared to do, was prepared to contemplate the kinds of concessions that none of its predecessors had been prepared to contemplate. And even though I thought the timing was wrong, because President Clinton asked me about Arafat and, would he make a decision? And I said, well, the problem is that Arafat never makes a decision except 1 minute to midnight, and the real problem is he doesn't tell time very well. And when he thinks it's 1 minute to midnight, usually it's 3 in the morning. And our problem is, you want to go in July, and your last day in office is January 19th. So he's not going to view this as being close to 1 minute to midnight, so it's going to be very difficult to get him to make a decision. But I opted anyway to say we should go because I was being told that by John Podesta and Sandy Berger that if we didn't go in July, the president, after the campaign kicked in for his successors into a new phase, meaning after they had each had their conventions, that he wouldn't want to steal their thunder. Now, having known Clinton already as I knew him, I should have known that was not a credible position, that in fact he was prepared to work until the end, and I shouldn't have gone along with it because it wasn't the right time. But that wasn't my big mistake. My big mistake was to go to a final status summit, and this is what occurred to me, unfortunately too late. We needed both of the leaders to be prepared to prepare their publics for compromise before they went. And it occurred to me only after we got there that we should have required each of them, maybe at the same time, we could have orchestrated it, we should have required each of them to say to their publics they were not going to get 100% of what they wanted on borders, securities, refugees, or Jerusalem. They had to do that because they had to prepare their publics for what was going to be hard decisions. They didn't have to go beyond that, but they had to at least say that as a way of preparing for the idea that compromise was legitimate. My expectation, had we really made that a condition for going, is we would have gotten Barack to say it. He would have resisted because it wasn't, Barack always liked to do things more through indirection. But if it was a choice between going and not going, we would have gotten him to say it. My guess is Arafat wouldn't have said it because I came to the conclusion that Arafat was capable of doing limited deals, but he wasn't capable of doing an end of conflict deal. The conflict itself defined him too much. the struggle, the grievance, the claims. They defined him. And for him to have to give all of them up was simply too much personal redefinition. So if we had known that he wasn't prepared to do that, then we could have shaped an alternative approach, a little bit like what you're suggesting now if you can't get negotiations to work, where we would push to shape a greater space for Palestinian independence. We would push to create more institutions for state building. We would focus more on people-to-people issues, on improving their economy, not as an alternative, but creating an environment that would make it possible for his successor to make these decisions. So that's one of the lessons that I learned from the past, and I still think it's important before we ever contemplate another summit, if we ever get to a kind of summit situation. All right, so what do I see are the biggest problems right now? For me, the greatest single problem is the disbelief on each side. And the disbelief, in a lot of ways, is a function of the lack of diplomacy. Simply, when you say we need to have negotiations, they need to keep going, it's precisely because we haven't had it. We have a vacuum. And in the vacuum, you have basically the worst kinds of behaviors. And it feeds disbelief. You know, one of my favorite polls that I like to cite that I saw from Israel was 69% of the public believe in a two-state outcome, and 91% believe it'll never happen. Now, when the disbelief is that high on the Israeli side, it's very hard then to try to go and sell peace as an issue. I don't need to tell you in the last election, you didn't put peace as an issue in the election because you knew the body politic would view you as being naive. On the Palestinian side, there is a mirror image, only the numbers are worse, because you used to have a majority that favored a two-state outcome, and today in the polls you don't. Now, do I think that Palestinians really don't accept a two-state outcome? No, I actually think that if they believed a two-state outcome was real, that their attitude would be measured, it would reflect something different in the polls. But it's a function of the disbelief, and it's very hard to go from a position where there's complete disbelief to suddenly thinking you're going to be able to negotiate and solve the core issues of this conflict. So I think you have to, a first item of business is to think about how do you address the sources of disbelief. And my attitude on this is we need to be working, we, the US, and this is, in the end, it's going to be more for the next administration than this one, we need to get each side, we need to focus with each side on what are the kind of steps or statements we could get them to make that would signal the other side that whatever you think about us, we're actually committed to a two-state outcome. On the Israeli side, I've emphasized something that make your settlement policy consistent with a two-state outcome.
Right.
And that's not the case today. You know, if you say you believe in two states for two peoples, well, then your settlement building ought to be not in what is a Palestinian state. The hardest thing I used to have to contend with, certainly in dealing with Europeans, but also with Palestinians, was, well, if the Israelis really believe in two states, how come they're building in what would be our state? And there's no good answer for that. Leave aside the issue of powerlessness, there's no good answer for that. If you really are for two states for two peoples, then you ought to say, you know where we're going to build? We're going to build in what is our state. And we'll build within the blocks. We won't build to the east of the security barrier. And in fact, we're going to tell you now, there won't be Israeli sovereignty to the east of the security barrier. We know that's not the final border. Right now, we're not able to put together a negotiation. We'd like to. But understand, our position is going to be, when we say we're for two states for two peoples, we're now acting in a way to confirm that. That would be a really important thing to do. On the Palestinian side, there are a lot of different things I might try to get them to do. I mean, I've raised on a number of occasions, with one of your former colleagues on the other side, how about you put Israel on a map? And his answer to me was, yes. Well, we don't know what the borders are. And I said, you know what you want them to be? You know, why don't you do that? I mean, another step. I mean, I've got a series of steps on the Israeli side. I have a series of steps on the Palestinian side. By the way, this isn't an alternative to negotiations. This could be one of the first things you do, either in preparing the negotiations or part of your initial agenda for your first discussions. But the point would be, let's try to get each side to do something that manifests their commitment to two states in a way that allows you to begin to send a signal to the other, not because that's going to immediately transform the situation and restore belief. When you lose belief, it's not like a light switch where you've lost it, you flip a switch, and suddenly it's back. But what you're trying to do is recreate a sense of possibility. The disbelief is a function of both sides have lost any sense of possibility. And again, it's very difficult to have a negotiation that is going to be compelling to each side, where they're going to be prepared to actually deal with the core issues if there's no sense of possibility. So one of the things, again, in approaching what I just said, it would be good for the next administration to try this. I do believe there are additional reasons that it's important for Israel to be prepared to do this even if we don't have a negotiation going yet, partly because Israel is also facing a delegitimization movement. And if you want to blunt the delegitimization movement, one of the things you have to do is you have to show the reason there's not a two-state outcome is not because of what Israel's doing. And if you want to blunt the delegitimization movement, if you want to be able to delegitimize the delegitimizers, then you have to be able to expose them. BDS is about no Israel. If you look at what they say and what they believe and what the principles are, there's no Israel. Now, there's an international consensus on two states. BDS is able to avoid the appearance that they're against that international consensus because they keep the attention riveted on settlements and occupation. Okay, take away the veil. Don't allow them to hide behind what their real positions are. Don't allow them to disguise who they are. So I would favor doing this, but I would also favor, and this could be done in conjunction with the administration, a kind of choreography before you announce this. Figure out how you're going to frame this publicly. Agree with us. Work out a plan for how we approach the Europeans. Work out a plan for how we and you deal with the Arabs. I don't need to tell you there is an ability to talk to the Sunni Arab states, and I'll leave it at that, in a way that never existed before. And this allows you also to probe the possibility of doing this. Now, there's another reason I say it's important to do it. I think right now the Palestinians are weak, they're divided, their leadership is really, if you look at the polling again, the public is deeply alienated from the leadership. The leadership feels highly exposed. Their readiness to run any kinds of risk is very low. Their view of negotiations, as negotiation itself is a concession, is very high. So it may not be so easy to be able to get things going again unless Israel takes the initial step. And again, the payoff here may be in terms of what we work out in advance together to be able to begin to set a stage. All right, let me take a couple more minutes and then we'll turn it over to you. I wanted to say something about also a couple other lessons I've learned from the past, but also a lesson that emerges in my book. The book is itself about the U.S. relationship from Truman to Obama. I look at every administration in terms of its key assumptions towards the region, because in many ways our relationship with Israel was derivative of how we read the region. Too often we felt that what motivated the Arabs and their main priorities was their preoccupation with Israel, and that was almost never the case. Their preoccupation was who threatened them and how could they enhance their security and their survival. And the connection to us was a function of what we did to provide for their security and their survival. They may not like Israel, but they didn't view that as the threat. They viewed their regional competitors as the threat. So in the 50s and 60s, it was Nasser, and then it was Gaddafi, and then it was Saddam Hussein, and today it's Iran. And that's who they never were going to make their relationship with us dependent upon what we did with Israel, because that wasn't relevant to what was most important for them. But so in the book, I go through a lot of these. I go through the different administrations and these assumptions and how they were, in a sense, invalidated over time, but the lessons were never learned. But that was about the region. I also have a couple assumptions about our relationship with Israel, and specifically on the peace issue. And one of the things I show over time is because we always elevated the peace issue, and that was our priority, we were always pushing the Israelis, especially on peace, to tell us what they could do. And I recount in great detail different administrations trying to draw out of Israel what could they actually do. There's this great exchange I have between Kissinger and Eban and Rabin in 1971. Rabin at that time is the Israeli ambassador to the United States. And Kissinger, is saying, look, okay, you don't want to tell Gunnar Jarring what you can do. Tell us what you can do. We're your only friends. At least tell us. And Eban says, well, I might be able to tell you part of what we can do in about 10 days. and Kissinger blows up. And he says, we're your only friends. Okay, at least tell us. Now, I would love to say that was the only time that conversation took place. But the conversation is repeated over and over and over again. And I show it in the book, how often the conversation is repeated. And I think it's fair to say that maybe I had a few of those conversations as well in my role. And I explained the reason the Israelis are always resistant was because basically they were convinced that whatever they told us wouldn't be good enough. When we went to the Palestinians or we went to the Arabs, they would say not good enough. And that meant we would come back to Israel and ask for more. And they were always afraid it was going to be a slippery slope. So I suggest we can still have this conversation, but we need to, A, recognize what the Israeli fear is in terms of holding back. Some of it is, of course, a fear that even if we say we're not going to tell the other side, there's a fear we will, and therefore it gets pocketed by the other side. But so one thing we could do, assuming we have a relationship of trust between us, is we could say, all right, look, tell us what you can do. Historically, and something else I show, whenever the Israelis raise any idea, they always want us to go sell it to the Arabs. There's been this constant historic view, if the minute we present something, the Arabs will shoot it down. If you present it, they won't shoot it down. And so I said, look, if to the extent to which they want us to sell an idea they have, even quite apart from us being told by them what they can do, we should basically say, look, we're prepared to sell ideas, but we're not prepared to sell ideas that we know can't work. So all right, tell us what you can do, and if we think it can't work, we'll tell you, and then we're not going to try to sell it. But if we think, actually, this is really legitimate, and this meets the Palestinian needs as well, then, we're prepared to back you on it, and we're prepared to tell the Palestinians, we're standing by this. And if the Palestinians reject it, and they're not really prepared to do anything about it, then our position can be to be prepared to say something in public about it. I would have not given Abu Mazen a pass when he didn't respond to the president. As you know, the president actually he didn't just ask him to respond, he gave him a deadline to respond. And he didn't respond at all. And we should have called him on it. For the Palestinians, any compromise, given a political culture where they see themselves as the victim of a great injustice, where they see themselves as the weaker party, where they see themselves in a position where their grievance should dominate, the idea of compromise itself is extremely difficult for them. So when we have made proposals to them and they don't respond, they have to know we're going to call them on it. Because one of the things that is important to them, the single greatest achievement they have in their own mind is that their cause has been accepted as legitimate on the world stage. Now, one of the ways you move them is if it becomes clear that it's not going to be understood that they had a real opportunity to make peace and they didn't take it, because that could begin to affect them. So when I think about our conversation with Israel on trying to draw them out, I think we have to be honest about what we think will work and what won't work. And if they want us to really get behind an idea, they have to know if it doesn't meet the threshold we think will work, okay, we won't. That doesn't mean we're going to in any way work against it. I prefer, and by the way, when you're dealing directly with the Palestinians, typically that's the best way to really work things out. It's better than us intervening, but when there's a desire to have us intervene, there's a basis on which we'll do it and there's a basis on which we won't do it. And just to conclude, I think that for us, for the next administration, it also needs to approach diplomacy in a way that is consistent with something that Tzipi said. We have had a tendency in some administrations to either say, if we can't solve the whole thing, then we're going to do nothing. And in some ways, that reflected this administration. And when you do that, you set up an equation where, since you're going to fail in solving the whole thing, you rationalize doing nothing. Well, the one thing I can tell you can't do is nothing. Because when you do nothing, you create a vacuum. I like to say this when it relates to a place like Syria. If you say our only two choices are, we have to put thousands of boots on the ground or we do nothing, Well, that's going to mean we're going to do nothing. Well, then you're going to have a vacuum there, and you've seen who's filled it. The peace process or diplomacy is the same thing. If the choice is solving everything or doing nothing, and you do nothing, we have seen what the consequences are of doing nothing. That's not an option.
Thank you. I think the first question I'd like to ask, and it's really going to go to both of you, because I see some difference between you, really goes to the role of the United States, and more broadly, the role of a mediator. Now, I've had a lot of experience as a mediator, not certainly in terms of statecraft officially between Israelis and Palestinians, but in terms of complex, mostly commercial disputes. Some mediators spend almost all their time in shuttle diplomacy, talking to you in one room, essentially haggling with you to see how much I can get you to offer, and then going into the other room and haggling with the other side. I was struck, for example, if you ask the question, how much time during Camp David with President Clinton was spent with both leaders in the same room talking to each other, it turns out it was trivial. It was all shuttle. Jimmy Carter's was all shuttle. My own strong preference is to have the parties together so they can see each other, all right? Moreover, I'm going to say something in response to what you said, Dennis, because in your marvelous book, you describe over and over again how the Israelis wouldn't tell us adequately their bottom line. As a mediator, I never expect a party in a legal dispute where I'm the mediator to candidly tell me their bottom line. Why? First, very often, they don't know their bottom line yet, because part of it depends on what they can sell within their own organization, and if it's a stretch, they don't quite know. Moreover, if they do tell you something, half the time, it's BS. What they're really doing is haggling with you, where they're telling you a, quote, bottom line to see if you could then go sell it. And so what I really wonder is, what do you each see as the proper role of the United States as a neutral in a dispute of this complexity, where there's all kinds of stuff behind the table, where obviously there are advantages to having a third party involved? You've identified some of them. First of all, there are political figures on both sides. And in terms of the final concession, if they make one, they want to be able to blame someone else. I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to go that far on Jerusalem, or I didn't want to go that far on the right of return. But the big, mean old United States, they made us do it. And so one reason they often like a third party involved is politically they can blame the third party for the hardest concessions. A second reason really relates to something that was also suggested. There's a formal intellectual term for it. It's called reactive devaluation. If Israel offers the Palestinians something, or vice versa, they each assume that, well, if they're offering that to us, it's got to be awfully good for them. And it's probably not so good for us because they have a little bit of a zero-sum mentality. And, by the way, it's never going to be their bottom line, so we're going to push back, even if yesterday we would have said we would have been thrilled with this. Reactive devaluation goes to a situation where an adversary in a dispute, because the offer is made by their adversary, no longer thinks through carefully whether it serves their interests, but disparages it because they think there could be more, and they think that their adversary really is in favor of them. What's a solution? I've written about this. Often what a mediator does is puts forward as the mediator's proposal. I've done this, I confess it, where really it was an idea that was given to me as one of the parties, but the party said, you know, if I offer that, they're going to discount it. If it comes from you and you think it's sensible, it's got a better chance. So I acknowledge third parties can be helpful. But nonetheless, as you really suggested in your presentation, all this shuttle stuff where you're just haggling through someone else, I think is not a particularly powerful way of moving towards a resolution. Is that perception of mine, given you both had vast experience, what do you think of that perception of mine?
You want to start?
I think that I believe that the American involvement in any negotiations is crucial.
Crucial.
But you're speaking about the role of a mediator. And I'm not sure that the role of the US, which is crucial in any negotiation, should be a kind of a mediator.
You want us to be a guarantor. That's what you're suggesting.
Entirely.
Not. The US has its own interests in the region. And it's not only what the Israelis are willing to give and what they need to get and what the Palestinians are willing to give and what they need to get. And not everything is a zero-sum game.
Of course not.
I believe that the discussion that we had for many years now, and Dennis is a part of it, with the US, was on several issues, not what the Palestinians want or what we want, but what is really, I don't want to be naive, not just and fair, in a perfect world, but what served the interest according to the US position as the interest of Israel and the Palestinians, and it's something legitimate to ask. For example, one example I would say, I would give now. And this is something that I did before I was Minister of Foreign Affairs. Dennis just said, the core issues that are on the table are borders, security, settlement, Jerusalem, refugees. Now, the idea of two states for two peoples is something, it's an American policy. The idea says that two states, the meaning is that each state gives an answer to the national aspiration of different peoples. And the meaning is that Israel gave refuge to those Jews who needed to leave Europe after the Holocaust and came to Israel from Arab states. And by definition, we are the nation state also of those that are living in other parts of the world as American citizens. The creation of the Palestinian state is the answer for the entire Palestinian people, those who live in the territories and those who live in refugee camps. So therefore, the whole idea that the US put on the table, and not only, and it's bipartisan in the US, the idea of two states for two peoples means something if we want to end the conflict. If we want to have an ongoing conflict with two states, the meaning is that to have an Israel, a Palestinian state, and the debate on the refugees to stay open. So this is just, and therefore I got the permission from Arik Sharon to go to Condi Rice and to convince her, and later she convinced President Bush that the creation of the Palestinian state is the answer for the refugees. And it was not a favor that they gave to Israel, but this is the only way to express the US position. Or Israel's security. Israel's security is not a favor to Israel because nobody wants another terror state in the region. We have enough of those. So the US can make its own position, not because Israel wants it, but because this is also the American interest. Now, there are certain issues that are zero-sum game. I'm not saying that everything is not a zero-sum game. So it's not a mediator that is trying to work with both sides until they reach a point of understanding. And both sides need the US.
Why?
Why we need the US? Because Israel's security is based on the relations with the US. Because every military operation starts with a phone call to the US. Because when our enemies are looking at us,
why do you need the US to help you achieve a two-state resolution? I know why you need the US for security.
Listen, I think that, no. I would like to think that if I got the position that would make it possible for me without another prime minister leading this, to reach an agreement, maybe I could be more successful. But it's not just about me. It's also on the other side. And both sides need the US, and therefore,
is that as a political excuse behind the table?
As you
Let's
said-
assume you're prime
no,
minister,
as-
and you're
as you said, both leaders now, they wanted this excuse, or anyway, Netanyahu wanted this excuse. This is why he preferred to have an American paper and not an Israeli suggestion. Because he wanted this deniability and to say that it's not him, it's them. The unfortunate outcome was that the Palestinians, this is what they say, didn't know whether Israel is willing to say yes or no. So this is part of the misunderstanding. Maybe it's their excuse, I really don't know, but this is part of the misunderstanding. On one hand, it was very important because both sides can have this deniability and without paying real political price. But on the other side, they didn't speak to each other. So they didn't know what the other side is willing to do. So there's, upside and downside to the role of the US in the last negotiations. And I believe, and we spent hundreds of hours with Kerry in the last negotiation. So it's not like we were not prepared and to work on everything. And I believe that it was a huge mistake not to put the paper on the table and to make it public. No. And then he said one thing about the Palestinian side. If they say no to something that the entire world believe that it is just and fair, they're surprised to it. Because what they do now is they go to the international community and they get from the international community what they cannot get in the negotiations room. Because when every time that a Palestinian state is being announced and a Palestinian state flag is there, it's not just a vague idea of a Palestinian state. It's a Palestinian state, 67 borders, Jerusalem its capital. No security for Israel, no blocks of settlements as part of the agreement, no demilitarized state. All the things that are already agreed upon in the negotiations, now they are getting from the international community without the need to negotiate. And therefore, since my understanding is that achieving peace between Israel and Palestine is really the interest of Israel, the interest of the Palestinians, and the interest of the US. So it's not just what each side is willing to give and get, but really what's logic, what represents the interest of all of them, and I completely agree with what you said. At first, both sides can reach, it's like, in a way, like magnet. At the beginning, it goes like this until you reach the final point that, unfortunately, you cannot make it happen. And this is really the most important role of the US. To say, OK, now we are here. From here, we reach to this point. Now we are putting our pressure, proposal to bridge this gap. But it cannot happen when the gaps are here.
So let me just summarize. What you think is a primary role, not the exclusive role of the US, is once the parties are close enough, the US might be able to make a bridging proposal and then put pressure on both sides to agree.
But they can help in helping both sides also to reach this point. Okay. Because it depends, because otherwise we would depend forever on the political willingness of both sides. And since you know that I'm now in the opposition, I have my own criticism about the willingness of
Dennis, you've thought a lot about the American role. You've been an architect of it. Was my characterization of how facilitating haggling by going back and forth where you're not having the parties together, there are limitations to that.
Well, it's more than limitations. It is not what the role should be. It should only be that role when they're incapable of talking to each other. And that basically is not what we should be about. What we should be about is making sure they are talking to each other. That was, by the way, one of the big problems with the last effort. It was a parallel effort as opposed to a negotiating one. And you discovered, I don't need to tell you, you discovered near the end that they had one impression of what your position was from us, and you had a very different position.
Exactly.
So, the whole...
But I found it later.
I know, but I learned it about the same time. And anyway, it's one of our role should be when there are misunderstandings between the two sides, we clarify them. That's a useful role to play. When there are assurances need to be given, that's a useful role to play. The fundamental need for us in the end is there will need to be, I honestly don't believe that the two on their own can ever make the final agreement without us, for a simple reason. The final concessions that have to be made are very difficult to make directly to each other. The point that Tzipi was raising is, let's say you get to here. Bridging that gap on their own is probably almost impossible. And that's where you need an American bridging proposal. You know, what produced the Clinton parameters in December of 2000, the two sides came together. We actually gave them some parameters to work with. They spent 3 days on it in December. And at the end of 3 days, both came to us and said, look, on our own we can't do it. We need you to present a bridging proposal. And my guess is that's probably what will happen again if we ever reach that stage. So that's a role that basically makes us indispensable. Yes, indispensable in terms of, I think, assurances to each side, which will be necessary as part of the outcome. Indispensable in terms of putting together what will be the financing of a peace deal, which will not be inexpensive. No one else, I mean, we won't do it on our own, but we'll have to mobilize that effort. I think to be the one haggling with each side is a mistake. You know, that's a role where you're trying to put together an ability for them to talk to each other. It's not when they're talking to each other. Sometimes the role is to prevent breakdowns, because you'll have the potential for breakdowns. You know, I recall vividly in the 90s where there would be an event on one side or the other where, you know, my real role was to be a fireman, to go in and to keep things afloat. And okay, so that can happen too. So there's a variety of different roles that a mediator, the U.S. mediator, should play. But what it shouldn't be is getting in the way of the two of them talking to each other.
Directly.
Yes, because part of the problem is, you know, we can do so much in terms of socializing each side to understanding the needs of the other. You know, one of the most interesting things that I did take part in a back channel, and I think the greatest single value of that back channel was to see in these discussions a problem for one side would be explained as to why it was a problem. And then how to address that conceptually was discussed. And watching this exchange, and then sometimes coming in, even there when I could see two people who got along very well together, sometimes I could see they were talking past each other. I could see that what one meant was not what the other understood. And so at that point, I might leap in and say, no, actually, what he means is the following, and you're misinterpreting it. So there is a role sometimes of playing that. But you know, if you spend enough time together, you really don't need a third party to play that role, because they get to know each other well enough that they get it. And I think that the role of the mediator can be helping in the convening, helping in the assurance process, and doing the ultimate bridging proposal. Early on, doing some of the socialization of why, if you want your needs met, you're going to have to understand the other side's needs. Ultimately, sometimes there's a value in sort of when you see maybe one side or the other not moving the way they might, you can go and say, look, I don't think you really understand the other side's needs. And it's valuable to say that, because then they want to prove to you, no, actually I do.
I have a couple more questions, then I want to open it up. One question is, I've long thought that there are a number of barriers to a negotiated resolution, but what is curious about this conflict is you can call them the Clinton parameters, you can call them the Kerry parameters. As a negotiation analyst, this is a dispute where the basic terms of what the deal would be if there's a deal seem to be reasonably well known. There's a lot of problems in the details. I want to acknowledge that. Jerusalem may be a particularly thorny problem. You know, and there's going to be an argument about is Ariel in or out. I mean, but what's striking about this conflict, unlike Bosnia, try to figure out how to carve up Bosnia. You can't. Here, on the basic issues, sophisticated people on both sides kind of know basically where the deal would be, and yet it doesn't happen. And I ask myself, what are the barriers? Why doesn't it happen? And there are a number, but I think the number one barrier, at least in terms of my own work, has been the internal conflicts within Israel and the internal conflicts among Palestinians. And that is, there are such profound disagreement among Israeli Jews about what the deal ought to be, where some significant minority do not believe in a two-state, on principle they don't want a two-state resolution. And in terms of Palestinians, there's a significant minority who don't want there to be any Jewish state anytime, anywhere. Now, I don't think either of those groups are a majority, but boy, are they a potent minority. And they can be spoilers on both sides. And the problem is, how does each side manage its internal conflicts? I mean, in Israel, even during, although it was done magnificently, during the evacuation of Gaza, I was involved in some Track 2 stuff during that period. You know, there were fears of real internal Israeli violence. It didn't happen. But in terms of the West Bank, there are concerns of that sort, where people say, why should we take a chance there could be a civil war among Jews? And among Palestinians, they've nearly already had civil wars. So I guess my question is, if the biggest barrier are these internal conflicts, what in fact can any outsider do that's going to have any real impact on that? Dennis, you said that the biggest, and you've written about this, the biggest failing in terms of Oslo, the Camp David, was we didn't put enough emphasis on the need for each leader to build a consensus behind the table ahead of time for the compromises. I agree with you 100%. How could they have done that? Look, you had Barack almost on his way out.
Yeah. Well, look, I said, at a minimum, you got to be prepared to prepare your public.
Right.
And there wasn't much of a readiness to do that. I mean, in a sense, what you're getting at now is, and this kind of gets at this issue of deniability. On the one hand, I see the great value in deniability because you don't want to provoke a major backlash before you're ready to make a decision. On the other hand, you know, it takes a leader, you know, it takes a Rabin type who is prepared to spring a surprise and take on the reaction. If you don't have a Rabin type, or I would say a Sharon as well, if you don't have that, because basically, you know, there's a fear that you'll provoke too much of a backlash and you'll never get to the point where you have to make a decision, well, then you have to have someone who's, you know, is pretty much prepared to make a big decision and then go and sell it. You know, I think it's a question that it is a question of leadership, and it's easy to say it analytically. It's easy to say it when I don't have to be the one who has to make that case and bear the brunt of the reaction. But if you're going to think about it, if you're not prepared to do enough in advance, then what you're really saying is you have a leader who's saying, I'm going to make a historic decision. I realize this is a decision where I bear the weight of history on my shoulders. And we are not going to have a future. If, you know, a Palestinian leader, which is hard to imagine right now, who says that and who's going to be accused of being a betrayer to the national cause. That leader has to be prepared to say, I'm not a betrayer to the national cause, I'm the one who's delivering on the national cause. And on the Israeli side, it takes someone who says, this is what it takes for us to secure a future as a Jewish democratic state. And if we don't do this, we will become a binational state, and I'm not going to allow that to be our future. Now, that's a very big decision to take. So, you know, the question is that the biggest obstacle to this? I would say it certainly is a very big one. I do think, by the way, there are some legitimate issues that are not so easy to resolve. Mostly, I would say they fall in two categories. One will surprise you. One is not a surprise. I mean, look, the narrative issues require big decisions being made, and Jerusalem is a really hard one. But I think security is more complicated than it was during our time when we presented the Clinton parameters. The Middle East of 2000 isn't the Middle East of today. And that suggests a different approach to security than before. And it's complicated because here, what are you trying to reconcile? You're trying to reconcile Israel's security needs with Palestinian sovereignty needs. And Tzipi was making the case before that it's one thing to talk about demilitarization. The question is, there's an issue of how long do you need an Israeli presence? Where do you need that Israeli presence? What are the criteria? Should you actually pick a timetable, or should you create a set of criteria that have to be met? Those are real issues, and they're not so simple to resolve. I'm not saying they're not resolvable, but they're more complicated than they were before because the region is more complicated.
And the transitional issues. How do you manage the transition?
Right. Those are real issues, and they shouldn't. The idea that, well, we all know what the outcome is, in a sense, that kind of suggests and makes it a little bit. That makes it. It suggests that this is an easier problem than it actually is.
That's right. Because what you're saying, and I think it's a very important point, there may be some sense of what the desired end is in 10 years, but there's got to be a transition from here to there.
That's right.
And those issues are very complicated. Right. And they create great anxiety because neither side quite trusts the other to do what's going to be necessary during the interim. I've got all kinds of other questions. I'd like to, oh, excuse me, do you want to, please.
I want to add to this. Well, you are right that in both sides there are those that would not accept the idea of two states for two peoples, but we need to admit that the negotiations were between those that accepted the idea of two states for two peoples, and we failed. So we need to address this as well, one thing. Secondly, the good news, and Dennis at the beginning related to polls in Israel, the good news is that even those that are voting for Likud, they support the idea of two states for two people, not only as an idea. If you put on the table what you said is basically well known what's going to be the outcome, they would support it. They know this as well. The bad news for Israel, and this is something that I say also in Israel, we didn't make the real decision yet. It's a minority in Israel who don't support the idea of two states for two peoples and basically support the idea of greater Israel. But when we are talking about a referendum for the future, we are talking about let's reach an agreement and then come public and make the referendum. What I say is let's make the referendum now and decide whether we are for two states for two people or not, because I'm sure that vast majority would support the idea of two states. And then, since everybody knows in Israel what is the price of this kind of an agreement, it would be easier for a leader to do the next step. But there's a need for a leader who understands that the price of not having an agreement is higher than the price of an agreement. But the problem is that the price of an agreement is a political price here and now, and the price of not having an agreement is the price that your people would pay, but it would not be in your term.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. I'd like to open it up, and I have one request, and that is that they be questions. I want a question mark at the end, not statements. And I'd particularly like, there are some students here, and I'm going to give first opportunity to any students who are here. So if you're a student and you have a question, let me have you ask it. Yes?
Oh, okay. Technology. Amazing. So as an Israeli student at Harvard, there are all sorts of questions that you're being faced with. One of them is about the current how do I say that, trend to think of a two-state solution as something that's basically over. It's part of the past. It was an idea. It's nice, but we should move on now to
The Friedman op-ed.
Yeah. The question is, what do you answer to these people? Do you think it's any serious suggestion, really? Is it something we're going to be facing with in the future, or is it just like a trend for now? And also whether there's anything that we can do, I guess, in our position that you think we, I don't know, can offer to the discussion.
We being who?
Israeli students abroad, I don't know, Jewish students abroad, I assume.
Okay, great questions.
All right, I'll say quickly, I completely reject it because you have two national movements competing for the same space. You have two national identities. If you say, the two-state solution is over, well, what you're saying is then the only answer is an enduring conflict because these two national identities are not going to coexist in one state. And so the answer has to be, for those who say it's over, there isn't an alternative. And the point is, we have to act to ensure that this ultimately is what the outcome will be. I would say, making your voices heard. When you hear that, as a group saying, we don't accept that. We don't buy it. We understand. There isn't an alternative when you have two national movements with two national identities. By the way, I oftentimes point out to people, in the Middle East, look at the rest of the region, and wherever you have more than one identity, what do you have? You have a conflict. But even in Europe, look at Belgium. For a year, because of the Flemish-Dutch differences, they didn't have a government. Well, maybe their political culture isn't a violent one, but even in a place like Europe, they haven't been able to work it out. So my answer is, people who say the two-state solution is over are saying, well, we prefer an ongoing conflict.
Another question.
My answer as a Jew is by asking another question. What is the other alternative? And the other alternative is the worst case scenario.
The gentleman in the back row.
My question is more for Ambassador Ross. You spoke about preparing the public. Personally, I'm one of the skeptics. I don't see peace happening in the near future because the public isn't prepared. I agree with you 100% about that. I think that both sides need to prepare their publics better, but I feel like in the Palestinian side...
What's the question?
We're getting there, because it has to do with what you said, what can outsiders do? I feel like on the Palestinian side, there isn't a genuine want, first of all, ability for the leader, like Ambassador Ross said. If Arafat couldn't do it, and we know Arafat was the greatest PLO leader of all time, who can? And in order to build that leader, we have to build the public to be able to have that leader say that he's not betraying the national interest. So why isn't the U.S. putting more pressure on the Palestinian side to stop teaching their children that Israel has to be wiped off the map, to start teaching their children that Israel exists, to stop putting on TV, people with children with knives slaughtering dolls, and this is how you kill the Jew. I mean, if that doesn't stop, how is it possible for any self-respecting Palestinian leader to bring that home to their people? And you have them walking away from deals, Barak and Olmert, deals that arguably will never happen again because, like you said, the public wasn't prepared. So I guess my question is very specific. What is the U.S. as an outsider doing in terms of education, in terms of imposing certain basic educational aspects of living together to build a possible future?
Well, the answer is not nearly enough. I agree. Look, I don't think that the Palestinians should get a pass. The things that appear on Palestinian TV, if you watch Palestinian TV for 5 minutes, Israel is responsible for every ill in the world. I don't think we should give them a pass. I mean, every once in a while, the administration will say, they'll make a bland statement and then move on. I'm not saying it's simple to be a Palestinian, but I don't think this should be just taken as, well, we can't do anything about it, let's just accept it. I think it's a mistake. I think we should call them on it. And we should say, I said I would have us work with each side to have them take statements, do things, take actions that would demonstrate their commitment to two states, because there's a level of disbelief on each side. So one of the things I would be saying to the Palestinians is not just put Israel on a map. I'd say, look, what you have, the constant incitement, has to stop. You know, and this is something we will be more visible about as a way of saying there's a price for it. It hurts your standing because it raises questions about what your purpose is.
Yes, sir.
See if that mic works, actually. I heard they're working. Yeah. Try just speak into it. Hold into it. Hold it.
Can you hear me?
We could probably hear you, but...
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for the presentation. My question is about to what extent the Syrian civil war and the Iranian nuclear program are overshadowing the peace negotiations. Do you think as negotiators this is an opportunity because people are not paying that much attention to the conflict anymore? Or do you think it is a threat to a two-state solution in the sense that many in Israel don't think this is a national security issue or a very high national security issue anymore? Thank you.
I think that you would hear different answers to this from different Israelis, so I would share with you my views about it. Firstly, I'm not one of the Israelis believing that we should negotiate just because the world is watching us or pushing us to do so. So it is true that the world now is not focused on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think, and rightly so, that for now it is clear that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not the reason for extremism in the region. It was the excuse of many extremists, but I mean, if we solve the conflict the next day, Iran would not change its ideology, and the ISIS would not stop cutting heads off in the region. So it is clear that this is not the focus, and Europe also is focused in all the refugees. So the world is changing, and the focus is not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But as I said, since it is our own interest, I believe that we should be those that would initiate and take in consideration also the changes in the region. What I discovered since the Arab Spring is that in Israel, when something is happening, and this is also true about myself, there would be also those that would say, okay, things are changing, let's do nothing. And there would be those, and I'm one of those, saying, okay, things are changing, let's see if there is an opportunity here. And since I believe that anyway, the worst case scenario is to do nothing because we can reach the point of no return or the point in which the two-state solution would not be feasible anymore, there are threats in the region. But it is also clear, as Dennis said, that we now have a new camp, which is very clear now, of the more pragmatic Muslim states or Arab states, so-called moderate. And they understand that their threat is not Israel. Now, when I come to Israelis and saying, okay, let's do something with the Palestinians, they say, Abu Mazen, he cannot deliver, what's the use of it, we are just taking risks. But if I can say to them, listen, if we do something with the Palestinians, and especially if we reach peace with them, we still have the Arab Peace Initiative. Well, nobody knows what is the Arab League these days, but we still have this group, so we can change the strategic position of Israel in the region if we can join this camp. Now, it is clear that they understand, the Arab leaders, that Israel is not the threat anymore, but it is also true that the glass ceiling of our relations with the Arab world is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Not because of the leaders, but because of the streets. Because in the Arab streets, Israel is still the enemy. And therefore, since it is very clear now that for others in the region, Iran is the threat and Hezbollah is the threat, and so this can be, and we see what the Arabs are now doing against Hezbollah, so Israel can take this as an opportunity by doing some steps toward the Palestinians and revealing or doing something that until now we are doing, maybe in closed rooms, but not public, and change the relations with the entire Arab world.
I would just, look, I agree with what Tzipi said. I think maybe there are some who would use it as an excuse not to do anything. In a strange way, and this was sort of implicit in your question, it actually gives you a luxury to do it when people aren't paying attention, and that's actually, sometimes it's easier to take steps when the whole world isn't paying attention. On the Arab side, this is actually a good time to at least probe. Look, what would you be prepared to do vis-a-vis the Palestinians and vis-a-vis us if we would take the following steps? This is a really good time to do that because there's much more of an openness to the Israelis right now than we've ever seen at any other point. And so I would like to see that because I think it also helps the Palestinians. The Palestinians, it's very clear, on their own, very hard to make any concessions. So they need a kind of cover for making concessions. And by the way, it's less us. It would be more the Arabs.
The Arabs.
But by the way, Israel needs a cover too, which is also not necessarily us. If Israel is getting something from the Arabs, it becomes a whole lot easier to rationalize within Israel, yeah, we're doing this towards the Palestinians, but look what we're getting from the region. Right. So there is an opportunity here that ought to be recognized.
Yes, sir.
Good evening. Thank you for the. Thank you. Thanks for the excellent talk. I have a question for Ms. Livni, if I may.
Tires?
Ms. Livni, if I may.
Yes.
No problem. Mr. Herzog has expressed an interest in, as a plan for moving forward, separation. As I understand it, build up the separation barrier and let the Palestinians get their house in order, and the Israelis can focus on taking care of their own domestic issues. I wonder if you have a position of your own about moving forward and what that would look like with regard to the Palestinians.
Two states for poor people is separation. I mean, we are not talking about getting married with the Palestinians. We are talking about divorce. But I would like to do it in an agreement because, as I said before, I can put the barrier, but it would not be an agreed border. And if it would not be an agreed border, so the world would not accept these as borders. And Israel is living for so many years without a real border. So there are steps. So the idea is separation. Okay, let's put again the GPS. Okay, the idea or the vision is Jewish democratic state. In order to do so, we need to separate ourselves from the Palestinians because otherwise the other option is one state giving equal rights to all the Palestinians. We cannot afford it because this affects the Jewish state. So we need to separate ourselves from the Palestinians. I believe it's not an ideology, but the only way to end the conflict is in an agreement, with an agreement, in an agreed solution. Now, if there are problems on the way, like in any GPS, when you are stuck in a traffic jam on the way, it's looking for different roads or other ways to reach to the same destination. As long as we are not giving up the destination, as long as we are not giving up the idea that an agreed solution is the best case. So meanwhile, as I said before, we should take some steps on the ground in order to ease the tension, in order to send a message to Yassirs. And I would like to add to this, it's not just about the wall or the defense, it's also free settlements activities outside of the wall. It's about giving them the possibility to build in Area C, which is going to be the Palestinian state in the future as long as we reach an agreement. It's to invest in their economy, and supervising it, that it would not go to terror. And of course, as was suggested before, also on the other side, they need to stop incitement and all this stuff. So it's coherent with the vision of two states is a separation, agreed separation. That's it.
I think we're going to go for about 5 more minutes, so let's take a couple questions. Yes, sir.
All the difficulties in the process. I would like to know what we did differently between the first negotiation, the second negotiation, and what would we do differently in the next negotiation, because I feel that the vision of the two states it didn't update it fast enough as we wanted it to be. So the question, what was changed and how would we change the next one?
Okay. I thought before the last round, and I was mistaken, that the idea of an Israeli leader saying that let's give me a Palestinian for 10 minutes and we would solve the conflict was a mistake. Because, I mean, you're too young, you don't remember Ehud Barak pushing Arafat to the cabin and thinking that he can solve the conflict just by having this. And also Olmert saying to Abu Mazen, this is your opportunity, sign this map and we would end the conflict. Because also the other side need to take some time to have this discussion, to enter into the details, and in the end to have the deep understanding what's on the table and what he can agree to. But as I said before, the last round of negotiations was, I mean, it was less directed more with the Americans, but yet it was very specific, and yet we didn't get the answer. So I got all the reasons or excuses of the other side what's happened, so I can think about some improvement in future negotiations. I think that there is something that it's not only about the negotiators themselves, but about the international community. As we said before, when the Palestinians know that there is another room in which they can get what they want without agreeing with us, they prefer to go to this road. And by the way, a Palestinian state would not be established by this. But politically, it's for them, it's a road that they prefer to go now. And therefore, Israel needs also to work with the international community, because this field now is empty. I mean, Israel is not there. The Palestinians are there. And to have an understanding with the international community and also with some of the Arab states, what's feasible, what we can do, and to have the support. I see it as, you know, direct negotiations with two sides, then another circle of the Arab world supporting the Palestinians and also giving Israel something that we can also sell it to the Israelis, that it changes also Israel's security, and the international community giving or saying to the Palestinians, we would support this and you will get this as long as you negotiate and agree and reach an agreement. I am worried that during the years that passed without an agreement, there is an erosion on some of the positions or things that were possible in the past are not possible anymore, unfortunately. And
such as?
I mean, Dennis just raised the issue of security. Yeah. Not only because of the changes in the region, but it's part of it. But because when I'm thinking about Oslo agreement, it was so shocking that Israel agrees to it was not even a state there, but an entity, and then a state. Yeah. And now it's the obvious. I mean, we didn't, as a Palestinian state was not established, but it's the obvious. And there are, I'm talking about Israeli interest in the negotiations, that during all these years, there are things that we thought that we can agree in the past. I think that the Palestinians would not accept it now, and the international community would not support the Israeli position on this, something that worries me the most.
Oh, so you think that Israel could have made a deal giving less before than they're going to be able to do in the future?
It's not dramatically less. I mean, in the end, there's a deal. I mean, it's not about what we want to
I was just trying to sort of see.
But I agree that I think that we could have reached an agreement earlier, and now things are getting more difficult.
Look, I would just sort of repeat something I said before, which is consistent with what Tzipi said. I think now there needs to be an emphasis on trying to get each side, as part of the negotiating process, to take certain steps that would demonstrate their commitment to a two-state outcome. I think that it becomes more important given the level of disbelief. But I also think you need to bring the Arabs in. The Arabs need to be a part of this discussion now, partly because I think they will bolster the Palestinians in a way that hasn't been the case before. In the past, it was the Palestinians who would basically tell the Arabs, you know, we can't do X and we need you to support us in not being able to take a certain position. Interestingly enough, and it's problematic right now given, I think, what is the perception of the Obama administration. I don't think there's a readiness on the Arabs to do much in response to the Obama administration right now on this issue. I think with the next administration, it actually creates an opening. And I would have the next administration talking quietly. I mean, these are the kind of things you don't go and broadcast in public. You go explore them in private to see what are the kind of things you could set in motion so that when you announce something, you actually announce several things at the same time. A number of steps that each side is going to take, and what the Arabs might also be doing vis-a-vis both the Israelis and the Palestinians.
But you know something, I want to go back to the beginning of this session and what I said at the beginning. I think that we need to sit together, Israel, US, and the Palestinians, those who want to reach an agreement or say so, and to understand what went wrong in the last round in order to have a better round or a better next round.
And that's fair, to learn the lessons of what happened this last time, yes.
A last question. Yes, sir.
Hi. It sounds like the end point of the negotiations are kind of known. It'll be somewhere along the 67 border with settlements block, territory swaps, Israeli concession on Jerusalem, and Palestinian concession on refugees. So my question is this: how much of the lack of reaching this final point is due to gaps in negotiation, and how much is political willingness of both sides?
Look, I think it's hard to separate those two at a certain point. I would say this. The effort that was made, that Kerry made, and the work that was sort of done sort of leading up to this, and as part of it, there were much more detailed discussions on the final status issues than people really know. And on the one hand, ironically, it tells me the gaps could be bridged if there's the will, because a lot more is known about each side's real needs on each of these issues. Some are complicated. I do think the security issue is more complicated than it was in the past, but I think on the other issues, it becomes more a readiness of seeing how the whole package is put together. I mean, I'll just tell you for myself, my own approach on Jerusalem would be, in the quiet negotiations, get everything else done, and then say, all right, here's what it takes to close on Jerusalem. And I think if it's done that way, this can be done. Yes, does it take? It takes political courage. That's a fact, but that shouldn't be a surprise. You're talking about dealing with a historic conflict where each side bears the weight of history and mythology on their shoulders. So it's not it shouldn't come as a big surprise. It takes political courage to do this.
It's both, but there's a need for a political will, a political courage to make these decisions. And even when you know what, you say, okay, 67 plus blocks, listen, even to negotiate, when we say blocks of settlements, and when the Americans say civil population center, and when the Palestinians say adjustment to the 67 line, we are talking about completely different places. So in the end, it's also quite a work to delineate this line. And when you said, listen, in the end, Israel would need to make compromises on Jerusalem and Palestinians on refugee, this is, well, I don't want to open this discussion, but this is not the equation. And I agree with what you said about Jerusalem, and this is what we started to do in the Annapolis process. We postponed Jerusalem to the end.
Let me try to encapsulate what I've learned is, I think, the view you both share. I think neither of you think there's much of an immediate prospect for direct negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, although it could happen. You certainly feel that it should happen.
I think with the current Israeli government would not
it's not, you think
it would not happen.
It's not going to happen. All right. That's what I'm saying. Neither of you see a prospect of it happening now. I think the thing that makes me optimistic, and this actually confirms my own view. People say, are you optimistic? And I say, not in the short run, but in the long run, I am. I think in the long run, there are going to be two states. And they say, well, why could you think that? Things are so bad. And I think, like Dennis, the reason I think that, because there is no other alternative that in the long run can serve the needs of the two peoples. At the present time, most Israelis understand you cannot have a Jewish democratic state and absorb the West Bank. Most of them understand it. They're not prepared to make any immediate sacrifices to have that come about, but they understand it. And one question I would have asked is what exogenous shock might be necessary for the Israeli public, not just the leaders, for the median voter to be prepared to do it. It's not clear to me what that is. But the other thing is neither side is going to completely control their own future, because both in the region, in terms of the economy, in terms of all kinds of ways, there can be exogenous shocks. But I think that you both are both committed to a two-state resolution, and I think you both think that in the long run it's going to happen. And I think that's very important. Last question. On that point, you've already suggested this. President Obama is already very unpopular in Israel. To an American, I must say, it's shocking to hear Israeli attitudes towards the president. I understand it. I understand what the reasons are. But it's pretty shocking. I think before he leaves office, he should make public what the American, quote, proposal was during the Kerry initiative. Although Dennis has been too modest to admit it, he spent months before the Kerry proposal quietly doing track 2 processes, both when he was in government and when he was outside of government, and they had gone a long ways. And the administration, perhaps imperfectly, made use of that, but that really provided kind of the foundation for that Kerry initiative. The parties had gone some distance, although it had been in these separate, they had never done it together. It was through separate things. My last question is, I think there are both advantages and disadvantages to the Americans making it public. I'll state a big disadvantage. Both sides will reject it. The Palestinian Authority will reject it. The Netanyahu government will reject it. But because I think there's so much despair among the people in the region, for the United States president to say, look, here's where I think it's going to end up. It's not going to happen under my term, but here's where I think you ought to be aiming, and I think this could be a basis for further, ultimately, negotiations. I think it would be constructive. What is your reaction?
Well, first, I know for sure he won't do it before our election.
Yeah, that's true.
And so before I would want him to do it, I would want to know what his successor is going to say about it. Because if his successor isn't going to embrace it, then it's going to immediately undercut it. So I think a lot depends upon who his successor is, and that's up to a lot of you.
It's a very diplomatic answer from the ambassador.
Shocking as that might be.
Well, I would be also diplomatic and say that it's not for me to advise the President of the United States, but I said publicly.
You already said it.
But I said publicly that I think that the U.S. should have put it on the table right after the collapse of the negotiations, because it's not an American proposal forced, on both sides. This is the outcome of all these hundreds of hours that all of us invested in it.
Right.
So why not?
Exactly. Good. I want to thank both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.